As you know, Reverend John and I have been focusing on 3 books that were written by Brene Brown. And this month, our focus is on her book called Rising Strong. And I know that Cyril Chalk gave a wonderful message last Sunday and introduced you to that subject. So today, the theme, based on Brene Brown's kind of 3-step process, I guess you'd say, about rising strong. This first step she calls the reckoning. I looked it up, and one definition of reckoning is described as a time when the effects of one's past mistakes or misdeeds catch up with one. In navigational terms, reckoning, or dead reckoning, is the process of calculating where you are. Brene Brown writes that in order to do that, we have to know where we've been and what factors influenced how we got to where we are now. Without reckoning, you can't chart a future course. Brown goes on to say that in the rising strong process, we can't chart a brave new course until we recognize exactly where we are, get curious about how we got there, and decide where we want to go next. The word reckon comes from the Middle English reckenen, meaning to narrate or to make an account. And as Brene Brown describes in her idea of rising strong after a great fall or a faceplant, reckoning starts first by acknowledging our feelings and then getting curious about why we feel the way we do and ultimately how those feelings impact how we act. Many of us have heard this story of Jesus meeting and talking with the Samaritan woman at the well, Jacob's well. It seems like a simple enough encounter, but for the day it was considered quite radical. The woman, not known by her name, but rather by her ethnicity and reputation, was not the type of woman religious leaders would choose to spend time with, and certainly not in the light of day. But she comes to the well at noon, the hottest time of the day. She does this not because it is the custom that it is the best time of day to be there. In fact, most women would avoid being at the well at noon hour. Gathering at the well in that time would be considered highly unusual. And I suppose in general, to be gathering at the well at other times of the day was kind of like gathering at the water cooler or the local coffee shop today. It was not only a part of one's daily chores, gathering the water for the household, but it was in fact a time to catch up on the latest news and gossip. It was the time when women could gather together in community and share their lives, their challenges and struggles, their triumphs and celebrations. And it was an important time of connection. It was also one of the few places where women could gather together in public. But the Samaritan woman isn't a part of that. She is an outsider. She's not part of that inner circle of women in her village. They do not meet with her because they do not want her reputation to ruin their own. And so she comes to the well alone in the hottest part of the day when all of the other decent women are in their homes or shaded gardens, protected and safe. This Samaritan woman comes to gather her water, and there she meets Jesus. It was a kind of reckoning for her. It was a time in her life that she spoke openly about her life with someone who saw beyond the prejudice and shame. Jesus knew her story, her truth. He knew she wasn't part of the inner crowd. He knew hers was a life of perhaps bad choices or poor judgment. She had had 5 husbands, and the man she was currently living with was not actually her husband. Who knows what the circumstances might have been in all of these relationships? In her culture, the livelihood and well-being and security of a woman often depended on the provision of the men in her life. A father, a brother, an uncle, or a husband, but it would seem that hers had not been a stable existence, and so after 5 husbands, she is currently with another man, and whatever she had had to do in her life to survive, she was now ostracized and isolated from the women of her culture and her village. who might have offered her support were it not for their own bias and prejudices. And so when Jesus talks with her, it was unexpected and highly unusual. And so when the subject of their conversation was not actually typical either, it went far deeper than the usual water well chit-chat. He began by asking her for a drink of water. Then he quickly got the conversation focused on her. If you knew the generosity of God and who I am, you would be asking me for a drink, and I would give you fresh, living water. And he goes on to say to her, everyone who drinks this well water will get thirsty again and again. And anyone who drinks the water I give will never thirst, not ever. And the Samaritan woman responds, Sir, give me this water so I won't ever get thirsty, won't ever have to come back to this well again. I find it interesting that it seems that even more important to the Samaritan woman than getting water is the idea that she need not return to the well again. She would do anything to not have to face the shame and humiliation she experiences every day in her own village. She's been part of the community a long time. She knows the history of it as well. She knows it was built by her ancestor Jacob and had been providing water for his sons and their livestock for generations. She knows of their ways of worship, both those that worshiped on the mountain and those that worshiped in the temple. But Jesus seems to be telling her something new and different, something welcome to her shriveled and parched spirit. Jesus says, it is who you are and the way you live that counts before God. Your worship must engage your spirit in the pursuit of truth. You must simply and honestly be yourself before God to truly worship. I call that a kind of reckoning. Jesus is asking the Samaritan woman to be honest with him, but I think even more importantly, to be honest with herself. We cannot truly worship God or even follow God if we are not honest about who we are. One of the things that this generation craves is authenticity. They have been raised in a culture where people say one thing and act in another way. They have lost faith and trust in institutions and established political leaders who have often proven to be corrupt or working not for the benefit of the people, but for their own gain and power. Jesus is saying that the best way to be faithful to God is to be true to ourselves and to God, so that how we act and live our lives will be true and authentic expressions of who we were born to be. Jesus was asking the Samaritan woman to be honest with herself and him. Jesus was constantly encountering people and challenging them to be truthful about their lives, to stop telling stories about themselves that were not true. It is only by being honest with ourselves about how we live and why we live the way we do that we can ever make any changes for the better. I think the word that comes to my mind is accountability. Have you ever noticed that when you're trying to make a change in your life, it's important to share it with someone else? We can so easily make ourselves out to be doing well, or better yet, if we aren't truly honest with ourselves, that we can't actually make any lasting change. I always remember the line from Shakespeare's Hamlet when Polonius says, "This above all to thine own self be true, and it must follow as the night the day, thou cannot be false to any other man." But there's another piece or part of this process of being truthful about who we are and what we have done to bring us to the current place in our lives. We have to be truthful about ourselves and the emotions or responses that often come with that reality. My husband and I always referred to these in our relationship as our dragons, or some others might refer to it as their baggage. You know what I'm talking about, those moments when something happens and you react in a certain way and you think, this really isn't an appropriate reaction for the current event or situation. I've gone way overboard here. But you realize it relates to something else that's maybe happened to you earlier in your life. because we often react to current situations with emotions that are related to a previous experience, and it tends to move forward with us until we actually learn how to deal with them and to be honest and truthful about them. Brené Brown writes that owning our stories means reckoning with our feelings and rumbling with our dark emotions, our fears, our anger, our aggression, perhaps our shame or our blame. And this isn't easy, but the alternative of denying our stories and disengaging from that emotion means choosing to live our lives in the dark. When we decide to own our stories and live our truth, we bring light to the darkness. That kind of sounds like a gospel message to me. I think this is what Jesus asks each of us to be honest about who we are, how we've been hurt, where our pain resides, and invites us to open up to God all of that pain and hurt so that the healing can begin. The older I get, the better I seem to understand that even some events that happened in my childhood can impact how I behave in certain situations in my life today. For example, as many of you know, I was adopted as an infant, and I was in need of hospitalization after my birth, so I spent the first 2 weeks of my life at Sick Kids in Toronto. I know that we have learned much about neonatal care in the past 50 plus years. Volunteers come in to hold newborns to help give them a sense of security and well-being. I suspect that 50 years ago, with no birth family at my bassinet side, that I might have spent hours isolated without those nurturing cuddles. I understand that that was likely just the way things were done. My foster mother, who cared for me for the first 10 months of my life, wrote to my adoptive parents and described my daily routine. And apparently, she wrote, when I was left alone for any length of time, I would often cry and then scream, literally scream, until she came and picked me up and held me. Apparently, I also liked the company of dogs, so I guess I've just always had dogs in my life. To this day, though, I know there is kind of an emotional scar that makes me feel lonely or vulnerable when I'm left alone or someone leaves. It taps into that early stuff, I think. My point is that we all have our stories of pain or hurt or shame. And like the Samaritan woman, we do our best to manage them and live our lives. But Jesus calls us to acknowledge that pain or hurt so that by God's love and acceptance, we might once again recognize and accept ourselves and see ourselves as God sees us, as loving and valued daughters and sons of our Creator. Ultimately, I believe that reckoning in my life of faith is about understanding where I am at this moment and the grace and love of God that gives me the courage and the strength to face the truth of my life and how I might live my life more lovingly and faithfully, how I can be filled with that living water that leads to a meaningful and fulfilled life. Jesus speaks of living water that satisfies all the thirst in our lives. We are blessed to be loved and accepted as we are, and challenged to live lives worthy of that love and acceptance. So, my friends, let the reckoning begin.